SS Culture, Volume 2. Be Hard. This volume is translated from original SS publications. The articles are about being hard on oneself, being hard enough to withstand the war, and, to a lesser extent, being hard against the enemy. They are arranged in the chronological order of the SS magazine issues where they appeared, ranging from Volume 5 in 1939 to Volume 10 in 1944. The original illustrations are also included. Duty. Death accompanied invitingly along the path the officers and soldiers carried their mortally wounded king from the ferry house across the Oder Bridge to the castle Reitvine. As he lied on the bed, completely alone in the dark room, the officers discussed the day's misfortune. Death beckoned to the king. "Follow me. Leave the path of suffering and pain. Rest you should from the labours of life. See, I give you rest and peace." The king's thoughts circled around the bloodbath of Kunersdorf. In his mind, he heard the noise of battle, felt the combined strength of the Russians and Austrians, exhorted his army to fight, but had to recognize that the hounds were too many who wished to hunt the noble beast. For a moment, full consciousness returned. The trembling hand gripped a sheet of paper and put to paper the order to General Fink. When the general then stepped to the sickbed, the king's pale lips moved. He tried with the last strength to translate the paper. Quote, "The unfortunate army that I return over to you is no longer in condition to fight the Russians. If Laudon wants to go to Berlin, he could attack and beat it wherever possible. Resist the peril and hold them up, for winning time is a lot under these desperate circumstances." End quote. The king lies alone. Darkness fills the room, and in it, the hours of the unholy battle come back to him anew. In the feverish dreams, horses collapse, warriors die. In his ears, the shrill noise of battle roars. Then the eyelids lift and the gaze falls on the mirror on the wall. The king looks at a white face and glimmering eyes in the shadow of deep hollows. The king wants to scream. Death lays its hand on the king's shoulder and speaks softly, very softly, kind words, in order to tempt him from painful life. The heart beats tiredly. Since the lost battle, the king has taken neither food nor fluid. So the appearance of death finds it easy to promote thoughts of death. An exhausted body is sooner ready to surrender life. Behind the form of death suddenly steps the strict face of the father. "Did I think of death, son?" He thinks, he hears. "When all my limbs seemed to rip in pain, when gout befell my body, my life was only work, worry, and pain. There were countless hours when death would have been my salvation, but I was held by duty. Taking the path of duty is what makes a man a man. Only thus do you win the crown of struggle. And know, son, higher than you and I is Prussia." Frederick rises up. "Prussia!" passes through his lips. The loyal servant, holding what in the next room, peeks fearfully through the slightly open door. He sees the death sweat on the pale brow of his king and dares to pour a little wine over the trembling lips, and is happy because the weary life accepts it. With soft steps, the servant leaves again. Some time passes. The king pulls himself up and stares into the flickering light of the almost burned-out candle. Life extinguishes like the light, he thinks behind his high forehead. Only that light, as a lifeless thing, suffers no pain, No so unspeakable need of body and mind. Fever again shakes the king. His right arm reaches for the uniform on the chair and pulls out the small silver box. But as he feels the container with poison in his hands, the energies of life begin to give consciousness to the body. Again he thinks he hears his father's words. Higher than you and I is Prussia. The sentence shoots through his brain and his heart, and now, as the king again regains consciousness, the royal soul is also awake. Should I follow you, Death? Will you lead the army from defeat to new victory? Dying is easy in these hours of unspeakable distress. Always choose the harder path, the path of hardness, of iron duty. Only so does a man win the crown of battles. Just as the king's mind again thinks such thoughts, does the will to life grow. Another hour passes as the energies converge. Prussia needs the will of the king. If the army lies on the battlefields, replacements are hardly trained, and the officer corps largely consists of mere lads. The words he once wrote to Voltaire come to his memory. I, however, threatened by shipwreck, must bravely and defiantly resist ruin and think, live as king. He continues the thought, different than in the hour when he put it onto paper. And may not die, no! He shouts the last word, loud and determined, into the room. The chasseur enters the room as ordered. The king sits upright. Bring me breakfast, the king orders the servant. Totally surprised by the utterly unexpected transformation of the king's condition, he swiftly carries out the command. The king then summons his adjutant. When the highly surprised officer enters the room, he finds the king ready to issue orders. So, the situation is not hopeless? Russians and Austrians are divided about the continuation of the conflict with Prussia. Even after Kunersdorf, they shy away from Prussia's daring. The king's fire soul blazes brightly. Where does the enemy stand? He camps at this hour in the forest between the Oder and the Repener Alley. Write to my brother, the king instructs the officer. I proclaim the miracle of the House of Brandenburg. The enemy could have dared a second battle and ended the war. He did not dare it. Our situation is less desperate than it was yesterday. While the officer writes down these words, the king, the military uniform now already wrapped around his shoulders, steps next to him. The king taps him on the shoulder. Imagine what my spirit suffered this night. The scope of my suffering was almost too great. Death seemed salvation. Listen, as death wanted to tempt me out of life in this night, although dying would have been easy, I refused to obey death. In the darkest moment, my hand reached for the container that held the poison. Do you know what it means that I now stand here? Often it is easier to depart life than not to die. The harder path in life is always the right one. I have chosen it so that my state will remain intact. That was what my duty commanded. That's from SS Ustow, Gerhard Schinker, in the SS Leitheft, Year 5, Issue 2. The well-meant push into life, a chapter about hardness, even in the sphere of living beings. Too good is the woman, I have often thought to myself, full of thought, yet with a clouded brow. Unterscharführer Heine Pittman gazed at the letter he had probably read 3 times before this month. The others in the low room listened up. What strange things was he saying? Man, Heine, How can a woman be too good to you? Nothing worse than that should happen to me. Willem, the youngest, laughed a bit embarrassed. He is the softest of them all, full of sentimental feelings, but precisely for that reason he does not like to talk about such things, especially regarding woman. Heine looks up. He notices that he had spoken too loud. He laughs. It is not about me, you milk face. I am just annoyed that my wife cannot handle the children. We already have 3, but she still has not figured out the formula, the right middle between love and hardness. Heine, why always such harsh words? Why shouldn't they have it good in life? And why shouldn't a mother be good to her children? For all I care, even too good. Must there always be struggle and war in life? Just look around at the animal world back home, when the mother animal cares for her offspring. How is all of that, full of love and care, really an example for us humans? The well-meant push into life. Yes, we should seek our examples in the animal kingdom. Heine nods robustly, but he smiles a bit. For all I care, even among animal mothers, there you find the right balance between love and hardness. How lovely does it look to us, a duck with flock of young ducks swimming around their mother. And yet, do you know that each of these ducklings has already had to look death in the eye, and the mother herself puts her little ones to their test? Let me explain. Many breeds of duck often make their nests in the stumps and holes of old trees. Ducks flee nests. Nature gives them all the necessary equipment from the start, except that they cannot yet fly. Nonetheless, the old duck does not wait long. Hardly have the eggs hatched when she, coarse and heartless, it may seem to a tender heart, pushes her children down from the height. Spalt, the little ones lie in the grass, and not all of them remain uninjured, but the mother takes the others to the duck's life element, the water. How else is she supposed to do it? This hardness is in reality the only possible care. The birds, especially the auks of the Nordic bird islands, are even rougher with their young. Those cliffs are much higher than trees, often more than 100 meters, but still, at the right time, the young auks get their well-meant push into life, which after the long fall leads straight into the sea. Whoever does not survive it would have perished anyway, and great Mother Nature concerns itself little with the individual when the whole is at stake. We humans should learn from that. Who, out of pure humanity, have become soft, cowardly, and hence unnatural. Raven parent, those are the best parents. The comrades are somewhat astonished. They ponder how nature reveals itself to be so reasonable in a small, dumb animal. But Willem offers an objection. Certainly, I understand, for such water animals are forced to take off, and it is sometimes necessary. But that is an exception. Such raven parents don't exist otherwise. You say it yourself, with ravens and storks, and with birds of prey, indeed with all the birds we esteem due to their great love of their young. What? Raven parents? Who are downright infamous for their cruelty. Willem is visibly excited. It's about his issue. Yes, indeed, the ravens, as well as cranes, jackdaws, and magpies, do it right in terms of raising their young. They devoutly feed their young, who must huddle in the nest blind and naked until they can fly. Each tidbit is stuffed into their mouth. But only, and now comes the command of a higher authority, only so long as, and so soon as the young open their beaks when the parents arrive, but they can only do that when they are healthy, strong, and eager for life. If a young animal becomes seriously ill, it lies exhausted in the nest and no longer seeks food, and it does not yet get any more food, not among any species of bird. Among most, the sick little birds soon pushed out of the nest by the siblings or their parents. Sensitive souls with a sentimental love for all and even love for the enemy find such young ravens dead under the colony trees and furiously look up at the nest of the squawking raven parents, and do not know that these animals had already died in the nest and could have never remained alive. Those were perhaps the same noble people who simply avoided their duty to have many children. Next to and around them, they can see hundreds of good children from poor circles suffer and hunger, and they get indignant over any adjustment for family burdens. Yes, stop, Heine. Willem has a new objection. You speak of family adjustment. That is a welfare measure of the state, an act of love. One could call it. How does that fit with your affirmation of hardness? Not love alone, hardness too is wanted by life. It fits very well, for genuine life and above all, human life must contain both love and hardness. The mother and father would indeed be raven parents if they did not care for their suckling with all their might, and in the event of its illness strive for its recovery with all medical means. But in the course of development come occasions where it must be shown whether the strength, the care, and the traits really suffice for the demands of existence. Such a test is imposed, for example, on all the prairie animals, young horses, young gazelles, antelopes, giraffes, and ostriches. The first time a predator forces the herd and the mother to flee, the mother can lick the young so tenderly and suckle it, but at the moment of danger she joins the common fight, and the young animal must come along, even if the thin legs are still so clumsy. Parents and ever so concerned parents cannot protect their children from such tests. These tests come, and they are always just so hard that a healthy human can pass them. What does not cast us down, as the saying goes, makes us stronger. That is why it is a false love by mothers and aunts, teachers and educators to avoid such tests and to eliminate any hardness from the life field of children. Children who grow up that way also later flee from the real face of life and its hardness, withdraw from all tests, and would love most of all to believe in a kingdom of eternal love on this battle-torn earth. Every struggle is a horrible experience for them, and every hard fate brings them to the edge of desperation. Tell me then, Heine. Willem smiles, a little embarrassed. By that you probably mean me. After all of you know how hard it was for me back in July and August of last year when we became acquainted with the first Bolshevist atrocities. To draw the necessary conclusion, I was also raised wrong. During the French campaign, I did not feel as acutely how my upbringing would produce in a conflict with being a soldier. The fighting back then was more like a game of chess. The enemy would give up when he saw a superior force opposing and surrounding him. But when we moved east and experienced the subhumanity here, then you saw yourselves how everything in my body and soul churned when it came down to repaying hardness with hardness, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But today, and I have Heine to thank for it, I have had a finalizing hour of instruction which clarifies for me inside where love and goodness have their place and where pitiless hardness is necessary. SS Leitheft, Year 7, Issue 10b. You or I? Thoughts about hardness in struggle and the will to victory. Force against force, that is the eternal character of life. But it is also the wisdom of the soldier, above all in war. For war is the father of all things. In all of nature, forces are continually struggling with one another. The sea again and again assaults the wall that the earth has erected against its onslaught. The storm rages again and again against the forest in order to break the tree that cannot resist its assault. Eternal conflict is the fate of life. Where I have found life, I have found the will to power, said Friedrich Nietzsche. The will to self-assertion, to supremacy, to victory. Who desires life must fight, and who does not wish to fight in this world of eternal struggle does not deserve life, says the Führer. But everywhere force stands against force and will against will is proven above all in time and war. A millionfold stood force against force, energy against energy, the will to life against the will to life, and the superior, the faster in decision, and in attack, the more clever and more capable in the usage of means and weapons holds the field and triumphs, and it depends on the individual that he resists and defends to the last, in that he, if necessary, takes as many enemies as possible with him to death, through the employment of his strength, and his life best serves the whole and its victory. The individual can fall through coincidence and through fate, but the community of the best will be victor, and in its victory the fighting and struggling of all who sacrifice their lives in battle finds its final fulfillment. According to Germanic and National Socialist faith, the highest and holiest purpose of all bearing, all life, all struggle, is the life and well-being of the God-given life community of the folk, beyond the mortality of the individual. The life, the immortality, and the victory of the life community is hence also the holiest purpose of war, and victory in war is at the same time a revelation of a divine justice that rules in the order of the world. In that one fights for victory, one also fights for right and justice. Therefore, all hardness in struggle is holy and necessary. For each hardness that war demands is right and just. The law of nature that gives right to the sea when it continues pounding the coast is ripped away piece by piece, also gives right to the warrior when he triumphs in battle against his opponent. Therefore, the motto in all of nature, as in the life struggle of folks, is you or I. Hence, not pity, rather just courage and hardness save life, because war is just the eternal character of life. So spoke Friedrich Nietzsche of war and war folk. You should seek your enemy. You should wage your war, and for your thoughts. You should love peace as a means to new wars, and the short peace more than the long. I do not advise you for work, rather for struggle. I do not advise you to peace, rather to victory. Your work should be a struggle, your peace a victory. One can only be silent and sit still when one has bow and arrow. You say, it is the good cause that sanctifies a war. I say, it is the good war that sanctifies any cause. War and courage have done more good things than charity. Not your pity, rather your courage saved the unfortunates in the past. What is good, you ask? Being brave is good. SS Lightheft, Year 7, Issue 10b. All that must be struggled through. Quote, from On the Road, 2nd of April 1932. The hardness of the present war places the demands on the entire German folk that the National Socialist movement's period of struggle once placed on the individual fighters. For November the 9th, we publish here a letter by Dr. Hermann Gmelin, who, as district leader of Landsberg and Weilheim, died in an accident shortly after the rise to power in the year 1933. It is taken from the letters of a fighter and speaks for itself. You can't imagine my present life since Green Thursday I spoke again, except for Easter Sunday, each evening in closed assemblies, and that will go on every day until the provincial election day on 24th of April. On Palm Sunday, Uli Gutz was confirmed. I could not even attend the blessing because I had to go to Munich for a Führer conference, from which I did not return until 4 p.m. Yesterday evening I spoke in P. Spent the night at the home of a party comrade, so simple that my bed was in the family bedroom, married couple with children. This morning, purchases in Munich, afternoon business in Hersching and Diesen. This evening I speak in Issing and return home at 1 a.m. Depart at 6 a.m., motorcycle to Munich, from there by train to Freilassing near Salzburg. There between 3 p.m. and 8 p.m. I must speak 3 to 4 hours in 2 different towns. That is how it goes on. 10 days prison await me because I supposedly violated the November emergency decrees in the struggle for the freedom for my folk. Uli Gutz is supposed to return to school in a week. I do not know where I am supposed to get the 55 Reichsmarks each month. And despite all the worries, one must keep one's wits, must convince thousands of opponents in assemblies, must give them hope and enthusiastic faith, so they become fellow fighters, and must not burden them with how one struggles desperately for oneself and one's own family. Only rare are the hours of contemplation and reflection. Between them push the hours of worry for the family's existence. In the struggle, my wife again has it harder than I, as I am myself active in the struggle. Just like back then in the Great War. Sometimes I come home for just a short night, then the bills and unpleasant letters lie there, and all of that must be gone through and hard struggle through. If one is financially well off, then it is not hard to have a worldview, but to keep them despite the distress, to be able to believe, is a great gift. Fight for Hitler. You too. April 10th should find us ready. Comrades, under those unspeakably hard circumstances, the old fighters of the movement have struggled. Out of this poverty and distress, out of this idealism, and out of this passionate love for our folk, did the victory of the movement first become possible. So the apparent setback of November 9th, 1923, became a beacon for the rising of the nation. Strict training. Just like Lieutenant von Katte was executed, so too, according to the king's will, should the crown prince fall. The father has no opinion, because the king has passed judgment. There is heated struggle between the king and the state's loyal servants. When the king stands by his decision to have the crown prince executed, Buddenbrock bares his breast and says, "If your majesty demands blood, take mine, but you will not get that of the crown prince as long as I may still speak." The king awakens as if from a bad dream. One of his most trusted men, who is even allowed to smoke tobacco at his sickbed, threatens to end their friendship, and Dessauer and Natzmer as well. Prussia needs hard and firm men. I will train him, or he will break. The king thinks with determination and writes the instructions for the secret councillor von Walden and the chamber Junkers von Natzmer and von Rochwedel, who must watch over the sun in Kustrin. Point after point is set down in writing. The Crown Prince is not allowed to correspond or to write to anyone in the world other than 2 letters in the German language every 3 months, namely 1 letter to His Majesty the King and the other to Her Majesty the Queen. On his oath, he is not to write to his siblings. At mealtime, no stranger should eat or be guest. Rather, just the 3 gentlemen who are with the prince should dine with him. Around the prince no language except German, and no French at all should be spoken. Also, nothing should be discussed with him except economics, the county's constitution, manufacturing, police affairs, land management, receipt of payments, contracts over leases, and legal regulations and financial matters and records. As soon as the prince starts to talk about war and peace and other political matters or any sort of useless sciences in the world, it should be forbidden to him. It is also forbidden to the Crown Prince to acquire or purchase or even just borrow books. The Crown Prince is furthermore not allowed to listen to music of any kind or to practice music himself, or the mentioned 3 gentlemen will be accountable with their lives. Since the Crown Prince has much arrogance, but pride and arrogance are among the worst vices that are commonly hated by everyone, Secret Counsel von Volden should make an extreme effort to remove that arrogance from his head. On work days, the Crown Prince is to be awakened at 5 a.m., winters 6 a.m., At 7 a.m., the Crown Prince and 1 chamber Junker are to go to the War and Domain chambers. There he should be given a small table, chair, ink jar, paper, and quill, and the chamber Junker on duty should sit next to him. When the bills are to be taken, the prince is to be present and endeavour to correctly recognize and understand the bookkeeping. All regulations and orders made by the War and Domain Chamber should be signed by the Crown Prince, but not on the same line as the others, rather at the very bottom. Work ends at 7 p.m. in the evening. So that the Crown Prince accurately knows and does not disregard what these instructions oblige him to, he should often, at the very least, every 4 weeks, read through them and be made very precisely familiar with their contents, so that he does not forget this or that in time and act contrary. The king reflects whether he has forgotten something. He has written 30 chapters, 30 structured paragraphs, with a curriculum for the school of the future regent. Whether in Potsdam or in Wusterhausen, everywhere duty fills the hour. President von Münchow, Director Hiller, and a few officers stand with the king as the son appears at the door. Frederick approaches his fathers and falls to his feet. "Stand up," the king commands. The blood freezes in the veins of the people standing around. You still know what you have done and how godless your life was. You thought I would give in to your selfishness, but I tell you, fellow, even if you were 60 years old, you should not tell me what to do. Since I have had you with me since youth and know you well, I have done everything in the world, good and bad, to make a decent man out of you. Have I not meant well by you on every occasion? I wanted to utilize you in the war and civil commissions. But how are you still showing yourself after such an offence to my officers and my servants? There it is again, the punishment rod of Spartan strictness. No, the father still does not treat him today any differently than in the youngest childhood years. The examiner stands accusingly. You have hated everything that I love. You have rejected what is right and precious to me. Do not believe and think that everything good and evil in the world depends on a special fatalism that no one can escape. Man is not just a pure statue, and God offers his mercy to all. But the evil who do not want to accept his mercy bring themselves to misfortune. With divine help you should spare neither effort nor sweat to perform something good. Do you understand me? The king pulls himself together. His eyes are moist, but nobody is supposed to see what moves him. With heavy steps, he leaves the room. His entourage follows him. The son hurries after the father, and in front of the carriage he falls to his father's feet for the third time, and the father embraces his son. The son sees the tears in his father's eyes. Be industrious and become a decent fellow for me. That is all I want. The horses pull. Frederick stands upright and follows the royal carriage with tear-moistened eyes until it disappears behind the bridge. Then he turns to Fouquet. I did not know that my father loves me. From Das Friedrichsanisch Beispiel by Hermann Hirsch, Verlag Druckenmüller, Stuttgart, SS Leitheft, Year 9, 1943, Issue 1. Our Revolutionary Will. The second year of the struggle with the Bolshevik opponent now lies behind us. This winter, too, the almost constant assault of the Bolshevik masses has shattered on the resistance strength of the National Socialist Army. What that means is understood only by the man who knows the war in the comfortless expanse of the East. The numeric superiority of the Bolshevik opponent and the employment of technical means make the moral accomplishment of the German army an unprecedented deed. We are today clear that only an army possessing a revolutionary will can endure the strength against the Bolshevik masses. The old concepts of duty and military obedience do not suffice to produce that iron hardness and strength of spirit demanded by the conflict with the Russian opponent. There is no doubt that Bolshevism does not only work with mass and material. In the time of internal struggle against communism, we have learned that a basically negative worldview, as it represents by communism, can also produce fighting traits like hardness and courage. Just like during the period of internal conflict in the Reich, so too, in the last 2 winters, has the might of the Bolshevik attack only been broken by the even greater revolutionary force, the even greater hardness and stronger fanaticism of the German army. What the experience of this 2-year struggle with the Bolshevik opponent has brought must now become the prerequisite for the coming decision. The worldview, educational work for the army as well as the folk must lead to that uncompromising fanaticism of the entire nation, as a result of which each individual feels himself to be Adolf Hitler's soldier and fighter. The time is past when a few individuals could believe they could save their own personal lives regardless of the outcome of events. Between the two fronts of National Socialism and Bolshevism, there are no longer any islands for spectators and well-meaning observers. That is true for each individual in our folk, and for the totality of European folks. Either the whole ship, and hence the whole crew, will be saved, or the ship goes down, and with it the whole valuable blood substance of Europe sinks in the Bolshevik whirlpool. We SS men had already clearly recognized the force and gravity of the coming decision upon entrance into Russia and the first clashes with Bolshevik Guards regiments. Our impression back then has only been confirmed by events. We are, however, determined to make this experience of the front soldier This self-evident, wordless, fanatical loyalty to Adolf Hitler, directed solely at the annihilation of the enemy, an unconditional demand for each individual folk comrade. The German folk once experienced the tragic drama of a front determined to the death and a defeatist homeland. That was in the years 1917 and 18 and belongs to the past. The blame for the deployment fell on the folk's leadership back then. We will, with pitiless severity, watch that the spirit of the front is fully the spirit of the whole Reich. The Reich's West bleeds, and in no way stands behind the front in the strength of endurance and the defense against the infernal attacks against our residential districts and cultural monuments. Only an uncompromising leadership can employ and direct the reserve strength that are awakened precisely in this hard struggle for existence. It would be irresponsible and contrary to all experiences to, in a war like the present, one take any consideration of the shifting views of whatever know-it-alls happen to know. For that this struggle is too merciless and the prize too precious, the path of our politics and the fate of our folk will be determined by the Führer, and the minority determined to lead, just as in the 7-Year War, Prussia's fate and Prussia's victory were not produced by unsteady men and the shifting opinions of the representatives of individual provinces, rather solely by the king. In the World War between 1914 and 18, it was learned that the morale of the men is determined by their leader. The company commander is decisive for the performance and morale of his troop. A few men in each unit might be able to support him independently. What is true for the troop is true for the folk. A determined minority leads. History judges it. The responsibility of the future rests on it alone. A folk, however, wants to be led and more readily forgives individual mistakes that are unavailable than deficient decisiveness and lack of clarity of goal. If at the start of this war there might have still existed any doubt in the necessary of the worldview education of our folk, it has long been overcome by the length and hardness of the struggle with the Bolshevik opponent. Prisoner interrogations confirm that the Bolsheviks continue to emphasize political education at the front, in the bunkers and trenches, even in pockets. We are determined to be an example in this arena as well in the ranks of the Waffen-SS on the basis of the realization of the power of moral forces, just as little as instruction in the use of an individual weapon can be overlooked. So too may the worldview education be neglected, which is conveyed by the example of the Führer by occasional instruction, as well as the actual worldview education. The methods of education are based on the military situation. Our whole armed forces and our whole German folk must be filled with the energy of the National Socialist worldview. Half measures and compromises are doomed to failure. The more so as the struggle becomes harder. This war will only be won by a revolutionary nation and a revolutionary leadership. The use of technical weapons and military skill must be carried by a superior worldview. It bestows the stronger faith, and despite all setbacks, the hardness that alone defiantly wins victory. We are willing to draw all the consequences of this realization. SS Leitheft, Year 9, Issue 5, May 1943. At the last moment. 1. The longer the war lasts, the more difficult and harder it becomes. The deeper become our insights into its essence, into its meaning, and into its inner necessity. How minor and coincidental does its origin appear compared to what has meanwhile become of it? For a long time, it is no longer about individual cities, streets, or regions. It is about world empires and continents, about worldviews, and about entire human races. The war has become an act of nature and has reached dimensions that were previously inconceivable. It has grown past the wills and fortunes of all individuals, even of the great, responsible leaders. All, especially the leaders of folks and races, of empires and continents, are tools in the context of a mighty fateful happening. Although nobody can be released from his human responsibility, they are nonetheless first expressions of the natural, fateful forces behind them, which clash and emerge. It comes down to the same thing whether we speak of acts of nature, of fate, of providence, or of God. We know, for example, that among the ringleaders of our Bolshevik opponents, natural drives and instinct play an especially big role. From our Führer, we know that he sees himself especially selected by Providence for his task. Bismarck once called himself, in his own words, God's soldier. 2. Precisely, in difficult times it is especially important that we again and again examine these facts anew. The person peering deeper uses the language of earlier centuries, then he must recognize that many of the decisive figures of our present are no other kind of people than scourges of God, in the sense of the same pious speech. However, we realize that our Führer has been sent to us by God for our salvation and for the deflection of gigantic, lethal dangers. In the appearance and in the character of their leaders, Providence shows the folks and races what it intends for them. Genuine and true leaders always rise from the same blood as they, for creative nature bears and creates at the right time for the preservation and protection of life necessary members and organs. Significant leader figures in folks and races are thus anything but coincidences. They are the deep expression of deep organic growth and life necessities. As genuine leaders, insofar as they have not come over the folks as parasitical, foreign bodies, and by pure force subjugated them, they are the most sublime and noblest organs thereof. Therefore, it makes no sense to make a difference between them and their folks or their race. Their virtue and their greatness are only the highest peak of the virtues, as the greatness of the folks or races and vice versa. Only in an already incurable, sick and decaying organism would a separate and essentially different thing exist. It is the sign of a sick and degenerate thinking when the fearful, the Philistines and cowards in terms of threat, distress and danger want to hurriedly and preemptively excuse themselves by saying they are not the responsible people. Each individual member of a folk organism has a living part of the entirety and equal responsibility, share in the fortune and misfortune, as in the narrower sense responsible people of the upper strata. Guilt and credit always belong equally to the entirety as to the numbers of members, never solely to the leadership organ. Nature and fate are hence just. When they afterward always equally place and distribute reward or fault on the whole and on all members, it is pious self-deception when cowardly souls believe they can set themselves apart, when they want to disavow shared responsibility, when, with each threatening failure, they believe they can hurriedly wash their hands in innocence, as much as a high degree of responsibility indeed concentrates at the leadership, so little should anyone, even the very last, believe that he is free of shared responsibility. In each individual always appears again only the entirety with all its strength and weaknesses. Nobody can exclude himself unpunished and stand aside. Nobody may believe that is he there to take a position and can stay solely on the spectator side of the tribune of life. Nobody can be released from his personal shared responsibility. Whoever wants to do that and excludes himself is nothing else but a sick and withered member. The lively and healthy organism has the duty and must summon the strength to piteously cut off and annihilate such members so they do not infect and do more harm. May the goals of all creative nature and the intentions of Providence, which has given us the Führer, be ever so manifold. One thing is nonetheless today very clear to us. The Führer was given to us at the last moment, in the face of the most severe mortal dangers that threatened and threaten us simultaneously from inside and outside. Our folk, and with it our whole race, yes, the entire Occident itself, wandered along an abyss, and were just about to take the last final step, that fatal step, in order to and always and forever have its existence be extinguished before history. In this life-threatening crisis, the still healthy portion of our blood created for itself a knowing and strong organ, which immediately began the purification, the rejuvenation, and the salvation. God, fate, or providence have sent us the Führer so that he shakes our conscience and at the same time makes us strong, courageous, and faithful for the overcoming of the tremendous doubled internal and external danger. This, however, happened at the last moment, as our crisis approached the most dangerous point. We do not have to list the great historical deeds of our Führer. Almost without exception, they stand under the sign that they had to happen at the last possible moment. Let us think in this war, for example, on the launching of the Norwegian campaign, where it came down to a matter of hours. Let us think fully of June 22nd, 1941, where, expressed visibly in the sense of the great life history of our folk and of our race, it came down to mere minutes. The thoughts of our Führer were shared with our folk at the last moment, when it was already in the process of surrendering its life through renunciation and resignation. With a shudder we realize that the whole appearance of our Führer stands under this law of the last moment. Or were we not, through the defeat of 1918, according to all human reckoning, sent on the path of slow decline? With reverence and gratitude, we should hence step before Providence. The appearance of the Führer at the last moment is its sign that it has not yet given us up, that nature still trusts us with rejuvenation and recovery through ourselves. Only gradually have we become seeing and conscious of the danger in its full extent and totality. We should hence at the same time become conscious of what a merciful dispensation it was that the Führer came for us. The Führer's arrival is the clearest proof that Providence has by no means decreed the decline or our folk, of our race, and of the Occident. It gave us the possibility of a final great test. It places it on us to be able to prove ourselves in the final test, at the decisive moment. Providence has spoken in that it has given us the Führer. It is up to us to prove ourselves worthy of this mercy. It will guide us more secure and strong, the more we know that he and we are an inseparable unit. The more we place our trust in him, the more we support him with our faith, the more we naturally make his decisions and his responsibility our own. But if our faith in the Führer is as strong as his faith in us was,
when he in the darkest hours started his march for our salvation, then the past test will at the last moment become at the same time a new beginning for a great, deep, and rich life, such we have never experienced in our previous history. SS Leitheft, Year 9, Issue 6, 1943. We must become ever harder. At certain points on the Eastern Front, there is fighting, not mentioned in the Armed Forces report. The Bridgehead P is one of the countless, nameless places where German soldiers stand iron firm against the vast superiority of the enemy. For the few thousand SS Panzer Grenadiers who, as an insurmountable defensive wall, have for days opposed the furious assault of Soviet tanks and Red Army soldiers, who have experienced how the companies got smaller day by day, for this small band of Waffen-SS men who, hard and pitiless, strafed the ranks of the attacking Soviets with their machine gun bursts. Bridgehead P is an unforgettable battleground and has become the symbol of defense against a vastly superior force. 1 infantry and 1 panzer regiment faced 4 Bolshevik rifle guard divisions, 3 tank brigades and a motorized Soviet rifle brigade. 5 days of combat were already behind us when we first heard the name P. 5 days long the troop had beaten down one position after the other, smashed it, and pushed through heavily fortified Soviet defensive works. Then we stood in front of P. The night we took positions, it was pitch black. A rainstorm had suddenly set in, and it took effort to move forward. Stubborn as glue, the clay stuck to our vehicles' wheels. The path through the gorge was so narrow that only one vehicle could fit. So if a vehicle got stuck in the slippery mud, it turned on its own axis and slid from the path down into the swampy meadow, or the whole column behind it came to a standstill. Food could not be brought up. Munitions trucks remained stuck along the way, and gas supply columns got lost in the dark. Even the tractors could not always reliably overcome every obstacle. Only hours after the messengers had been sent out into the dark night could the battalion commander assemble with his officers in a hut and under the sparse light of a candle present the attack plan. The new morning did not bring an improvement in the weather. It rained, mist clouds floated over the gorge, and the sun did not want to break through. There was nothing else to do but attack in the rain. The P had to be taken. The bridgehead had to be established there if all the further operations were not to be jeopardized. The attack took place. The SS Grenadiers of the Death's Head Division, who had not really slept in 6 days, swung their machine guns across their backs, stuck hand grenades in their belts, as many as they could, and dragged ammunition crates. They waded through mud and swamp and had to again and again push aside the branches of bushes. They were wet, and their energy had already noticeably diminished after the past difficult days. But they were not tired because of that. At the edge of the village they received the order to halt. The fire from Soviet artillery became ever more fierce, and finally a thin curtain of fire was in front of them, which could only be penetrated with heavy losses. The men took cover in a ravine. The rain still splashed down on them. They ripped grain stalks from the fields and grass from the swamp in order to cover themselves, but that didn't help much, and they were soon soaked to the skin. What would happen now? When would they attack again? They looked at the first village huts, almost close enough to grasp the bushes and hedges along the river. They saw a few tall trees and knew the bridge had to be there, between the two villages. They saw the church's onion dome that jutted up strangely huge from the straw roofs. On the steep slope across the river, muzzle bursts flashed. Shells howled over them, and they pressed themselves even closer to the earth and breathed a sigh of relief when the detonations none of their comrades had to shout for the medic. The sole thought moving them in these hours was this: we must get across the river, establish the bridgehead, and then throw the Bolsheviks out of their positions. Meanwhile, behind them, the exact war machinery had been set into motion. The radios hummed and the telegraphs clicked. Assault guns advanced through the gorge. Reconnaissance and fighter planes flew in, circled the river, and spotted new targets. Light and heavy guns from the ready area moved forward into firing positions. All the weapons that could be brought up were used in order to enable the leap across the river. It was the signal for a new effort, a new attack. The use of artillery and air power could only last a limited time. The decisive thrust must always be made by the grenadier, by the individual fighter. Technology can make his fight easier. It can open the way for him, but he, and he alone, must pass through that opening. It was as if the whole fury of our grenadiers suddenly exploded. Their fury at the Bolsheviks who had believed they could stop our advance by firing from the barrels of their guns everything they could fire. Our companies soon stood in the middle of the village. Flares shot up between the curve of the high birch trees. Our men fought their way through the bushes on the bank and waded through cloudy rainwater. Soaking wet to the waist, they worked their way along the other swamp bank and attacked the slopes. Close-range fighting of the most bitter intensity unfolded as they entered the Soviet positions on the steep slopes. The Soviets had to be driven from their foxholes, man by man. Our armoured battle vehicles already climbed up through the little forest and gorge onto the steep slopes. Our grenadiers followed them and drove the Bolsheviks back more and more, far past the peak, through cornfields, until the planned bridgehead border was reached. The river crossing had succeeded. Our bridgehead had been established. Hardly had we advanced over the little river when our guns followed across makeshift bridges. Hardly had the first foxholes been dug when the Soviet counterattacks started already. They came in battalion and regiment strength. They even came with whole brigades and divisions. They brought up whole batteries of guns and hurled salvo after salvo at the river bank, the heights held by us. Tanks raced against our lines in a number we had never before experienced in such a small area on the Eastern Front. They were shot up by our panzer cannons and anti-tank guns at distances of 1,500 meters and more. But sometimes they also advanced against our lines and came within 40 or 50 meters and had to be repulsed and destroyed in intense fire duels at that range. Here and there they broke through our lines, but the men of the SS, fortunately, survived the tank terror of those days. They knew exactly that even a tank is vulnerable, and not just at one place. They calmly let the tanks roll past, snatched mines, waited for the right moment with determination, and ran across cornfields in order to be set for the final dash, which usually brought the mortal blow to the tank. But it was not just the tanks against which the defenders of the bridgehead had to defend. The enemy had, in all haste, brought up infantry forces, and these rested troops pushed against our lines. It often came to bitter close combat, where our SS grenadiers, only due to their exemplary calm and bravery, could win against the numerical superiority of the Bolsheviks. A panzer rolled back, the hatch opened, and the driver and loader carefully raised their dead commander from the panzer. Then the radio man, who had lost both legs from a hit. Soon afterward, they again raced back through the gorge to report to a new commander, because their panzer must not fall out. The lightly wounded incessantly asked the doctors not to send them to the rear. They wanted to remain with their comrades. When rain had again made the ground muddy and the tracked vehicles could no longer climb the slopes, there was not a single SS man who would not have ran to the munition vehicles in order to carry shells and munition forward to the positions. In the bridgehead, the foxholes got deeper each day, but with every centimetre our grenadiers dug in deep. With each comrade they lost grew their fighting spirit and will to resistance. Measured against the strength of enemy men and weapons that had been employed on all sides on Stalin's personal order, in order to force the division to give up the bridgehead, the SS men accomplished the inconceivable here. Above all, their commander, who was always in the foremost lines in his panzer, and intervened wherever the situation appeared most dangerous. The calm and superiority that emanated from him embraced the whole troop, and with it the fighting spirit that was born from the mission of the political soldier. Leader and men merged there into a block of resistance. Military history would hardly note the name of the Bridgehead P. It had been held against the enemy's overwhelming effort. The realization that only a hardness and ruthlessness towards one's own enemy and person, shaken by nothing, solves a military task. This realization is the principle of this war. We must become ever harder. Based on a report by SS war correspondent Zimmermann. SS Leitheft, Year 9, Issue 11, November 1943. War without mercy. We have entered a stage of the struggle that is without mercy. The men who clash there are two types of human beings, our mortal enemies. War in a higher sense is being fought here, which is indeed the father of all things. Its outcome will decide the face of the future world. In the fury of this struggle, the world must be transformed. The features of satanic hatred and barbarism must be erased, for they have no place in the new world. The sword alone decides in this struggle, in which all bridges are destroyed that could lead together. How many times in this campaign has the soldier of the Eastern Front stood eye to eye with this opponent? Even in the rage and fury of modern battle, that is always the decisive, the most difficult moment, when man faces man with weapon in hand, seething rage in the eyes, will to destruction in the heart, and one must fall in order to open the other's way to new battle. It will always remain the most terrible moment when man collides with man and the final decision falls. Close combat is without pity. I or you, there is no longer anything else in the world. Who has never felt the enemy's hot breath in his face and seen the murderous lust in his eyes does not know war's deepest secret, which reveals itself in that moment. Man is the master of things, in his will. In his hands lie the strength of the world. Only who has felt it, who has passed through this merciless war and been purified, even stronger, knowing his own strength and the limitlessness of human will, passed through 100 deaths and again stepped through the gate of life. For a long time we no longer fight for victories and successes as we know them from other battles. The whole Occident fights in us, in each individual, its final decisive battle. Two worlds stand in conflict, one of which must break and will be broken, since world history would otherwise lose its meaning. With full consciousness, each individual feels the might of this struggle and that of a battle in which everything fights with us, that 1,000-year history that has placed in us the good spirits of our comrades in Russian earth live day for day within us, and admonish us so that we do not become weary. Bolshevism itself has taught us the lesson that there can be no half measures in this conflict. We have become steel-hard, now only will and decision. We know that fate is in our hands, and we will master it. Never again will men be allowed to experience and see what all of us have taken upon ourselves in this difficult test, and bear until the final decision. An army of soldiers has grown in this war in which each is a fighter, with clear consciousness, with deep faith and highest ability to sacrifice. Each individual has 100 times passed through all tests and passed them. The genuine soldier of a revolution has grown out of faith and knowledge. He fights for everything that was holy to previous generations, for the safety of the homeland, in the fate of struggle of nations, for the life of his children in a world whose first signs rise on the horizon of the Occident. Nothing is death. Our heat, cold, and all deprivations of a difficult struggle compared to the mighty river of strength and confidence that daily flows into him from the soldier's devout knowledge and the hard realization of the higher necessity of this decisive battle. Ancestors and fathers fight in him, who is the knowing heir of 1,000-year history. Its virtues are his from the creative might of his time. He adds new forces. For him, the destructive power of war are only necessary means in the conflict of the world, in order to one day reveal their deepest meaning in the formative, constructive form of a future Reich. In this faith, with these strengths, the German soldier and his allies will win the decision which he himself has made when he recognized the deep meaning of his struggle. The day of victory will be his highest fulfillment, because he knows that it is the beginning of a new time. New battles will flare up. Hundreds of kilometers of Russian roads will pain our feet. We have already seen and experienced everything. We will no longer charge with the roaring elan of youths, which was still in us. We assembled for the great judgment. We have become adepts, calm, modest, and serious. All the fires of hell have forged us. The searing sun and the icy breath of the snow steppe have hardened us. The images of the existence in the insanity of the most devilish idea mankind ever gave birth to live on within us, as well as the knowledge of the gravity and pitilessness in which this struggle must end like it started. The sun wheel rolls over the Soviet Union. In flames and blood, a world will be born that should bring our sons space and peace for a happy future. We will be its moulders. We have passed through hell and been forged in it for alert consciousness and highest hardness. Our faith is firmer and stronger than ever. Death and the devil already lie behind us. New deaths and hells should not frighten us. Victory belongs to us. Horst Schlesiner. The genuine man's celebration is the deed. Goethe. SS Leitheft, Year 9, Issue 12, December 1943. One must overcome the dead point. What is expressed in the following company commander's field letter should be taken literally. It is about you and me. It affects all of us very personally. Despite the hardness of these days, we look into the future with confidence. But one uncanny realization often plagues me, namely that the latter, final sense, absolute unconditionality of this war is still completely clear to far few Europeans. Indeed, it gets around more and more, but the full hardness of the war grips only far too few. The Bolshevik wants to move west, and with him strides death. For all of us, without exception. We fight over existence or non-existence. All of us, whether we live in the Reich or in Europe's lands. What threatens us from the east is total destruction of everything we are, however one may label it. And the Russian is strong, especially in the one thing that has previously always decided all conflicts: attitude. He is so fantastically healthy that even the Bolshevik poison could not hurt him. Rather, it works like a fission fungus, which sets the resting forces into motion that now follow their law blind and unstoppable. Bolshevism, in the formerly poor Russian history, is a very great event, something that has moved the wide masses of this huge folk and still moves it. The Russians go into this war unencumbered. We carry a rich heritage with us, and it burdens us. It is like the Führer once said, the last battalion triumphs. In other words, whoever fires the last shot has won, regardless of how the game otherwise looks, and where this last German shot strikes. Who 5 minutes after 12 can still aim his rifle at the enemy ready to fire has won, even if he stands as 1 against 1,000. Bitter weeks lie behind me, weeks full of horrible experiences. We soldiers here in the East learn a tremendous self-consciousness and sobriety over ourselves. Here we become cleaner, better, harder, healthier. The soldiers who have already held out for over 3 years in Russia, those are the best men of our folk, by far the best. It is so. One should no longer train recruits in German barracks with shower rooms, beds, lockers, etc., rather in filthy nests on the east. One should no longer assemble German divisions in Western Europe, rather in the occupied east. Rather, I picked up 2 men separated from their unit who had been in The Hague just 10 days before. It is completely clear to us here that at first not much can be expected from such people, regardless of how well equipped they may be. It is really a shame about what all is lost in the first fighting. This view spreads more and more. Even troop units that have been in the homeland for a longer time for replenishment or training are no longer worth as much as if they had never been there. One must first overcome the dead point. One must unlearn looking back. One must learn that the path to do a real and genuine life only follows the detour over the defeat of the opponent. But there is no going back. The homeland is too beautiful for us. It makes us sick, slack soft. That has nothing to do with the mood at home. Rather, it is the safety, the measuredness of all life to our being. That is what makes us so sick when we return to the Russian misery, to the loneliness and desolation of pitiless demand, which has probably only been so absolutely imposed for the Athenians in their struggle against Sparta, or Caesar in his fight against Vercingetorix. One must understand that, also purely emotionally, otherwise one succumbs to the tremendous pressure that rests on one spiritually. When one understands that this pressure disappears immediately, in its place comes the ice-cold, active will to get at the enemy and to beat him at any price. During my various assignments, I have been acquainted with very diverse divisions, some of who have been in Russia without interruption since 1941, some in Germany during the war, and some that were assembled in France. The last ones are the ones who find it the hardest to get used to the unconditionality of the Russian land in order to gain a clear view for the gigantic possibilities of these expanses which wait there for Europeans' formative energy. In each head haunts. Back then in France, instead of saying, "Here I am, here I remain, and if it is not so nice here, then it will become nice. That is why I am who I am." The last, unfortunately, is only said by far too few. If we would firmly bite into the Russian earth, the soldiers would never get rid of us. But unfortunately, only a few firmly bite in here. Others dream about the end of the war at home, but not the end of the war as a free man in the East. And that is a big shame. That is what must come. At that moment, the Russian can try whatever he wants. He will not advance an inch. If we see the old world in ruins, we do not ask a lot whether much valuable and irreplaceable was lost. That makes sad and weakens the fighting strength. Let us ask ourselves instead whether we still feel within us a spark of that energy that enables us to erect the Reich from flesh and blood. If that is the case, and I know that the best of us possess this rock-hard faith, then we will also have the strength to build anew the high works where no old wall will still hinder us. In the expanses of the East and over the ruins of the West, cathedrals fall. Their holy substance lives on indestructible in our blood. So we are free for the struggle and will later be free too, in accordance with the eternal substance, build the new castles of a new time. SS Leitheft, 1944, Issue 1, S. Quote from Nietzsche. To be simple and natural is the highest and final goal. Faith and hardness. Quote from Frederick the Great, 1757. In such unholy times, one must provide oneself with innards of iron and an iron heart. End quote. It is not hard to follow the Führer in hours of joy. What faith and loyalty are capable of is proven only during setbacks and hours of stress. Precisely in these months, as the 5th year of our folk's hard and glorious struggle of fate comes to an end, it should be said that for us SS men, faith was never the same as blind trust in a malevolent fate, which would, one way or another, make things work out all right anyway. Rather that, for our whole life long, since we decided for the Führer's cause, have never forgotten to look the enemy straight in the eye and to include the changes of fate in our calculations. We have had an idea that the Führer has more than once had a heart full of concern, perhaps precisely at the moment when our folk cheered him and had occasion to celebrate him. Nothing, especially no victory, fell into the Führer's lap. He had to, so to speak, defiantly wrestle every success from fate, step by step. After victories and successes, one forgets the bitter path and the sleepless nights that led to them. After defeats, our folk is inclined to be thankless and short-sighted and to forget what has been accomplished. The path that lies behind us gives us cause enough to keep our faith and have the courage to not let ourselves be bent by any setbacks and to accept no defeat as final. Precisely in this historically important moment of our folk, the history of the 7 Years' War comes to mind. So near to the present. There is no span of German history that is more instructive and so full of most valuable experience for our whole folk. The struggle of the great king with his generals, officers, and peasant sons against a vastly superior foe in the unprecedented example, the secret of a nation's victory due to superiority of will. For 7 years, the great king fought on 4 fronts. The Reich, based on its central position in Europe, has, so to speak, since the cradle, faced the continuous threat of its borders from great military powers. Little Prussia bore and fought through the same fate that bitter Bismarck and today Adolf Hitler had to take over as heir and task. France, Austria, Russia, and Sweden stood against the great king. Back then, like today, the Germanic Middle had to draw 2 conclusions from its numeric inferiority. The first was the strictest concentration of all forces, an unbreakable, by anything, loyalty of officer and man to king, hardest fighting spirit, and an iron faith in their own cause. On the basis of these virtues, Prussia and its great king withstood Kolin, Hochkirch, and the most dangerous defeat of the 7 Years' War, Kunersdorf. After each war year, the situation was restored. Fate has a long breath and gives the crown of victory to the one whose bravery and spirit withstand greatest tests and stresses. The officers of the great king, more than once during the war, had to abandon homeland and family to the enemy, but nonetheless formed a ring of following around the king that no fate broke. One may plunder our lands, one may devastate and burn them, one may rob us of ground and earth, yes, even life. We will happily make all these sacrifices for our great king. That was the judgment of a Prussian officer in August of the year 1759. The great king drew a second conclusion from the numeric inferiority of his armies. He tried to separate the enemy by lightning-like movements and beat them one after the other. Prussia could never be successful on all fronts simultaneously, but in the fateful struggle, back then the god of war proved to be moody and made things hard for the king. Already, after the defeat of Kolin in the Second War year, the dice had fallen in such a way to make it foreseen that the plan to knock one main opponent out of the war through an annihilating battle had failed, and that there would be a long-term war on 4 fronts, which would intensify over time. In this war, the German army has to show a series of glorious campaigns in Poland, in Greece, in France, and in Norway. Then came the long hesitation, the 8th month wait of our troops in France, shortly before the invasion in England. The 4th opponent, the most imponderable of all, Russia, was closer to intervention than one could expect. Its constantly escalating, blackmailing demands proven it. On June the 21st, 1941, it was decided that fate would not spare us a 2-front war, and similarly, like after Kolin in the 7 Years' War, after the pitiless winter of 1941-42, it was clear that the enemy in the east was not to be driven from the field through lightning-like operations. The West, hence, had time to catch up. We stand in the effects of this situation. It will be mastered. It will be mastered alone by unchallengeable loyalty to the Führer, by unconditional obedience and readiness to action to the last. May we in these hours remember what has been accomplished. The countless dead of the National Socialist Army cover glorious battlefields. Now we must not beat an eyelash. We take blows, stubborn but not desperate. More than once since 1918, fate has put the Führer and our folk to the test. Adolf Hitler, with a small and then ever-growing number of loyal followers, year after year overcame each threat. hours of the most extreme risk had to be mastered. From the introduction of universal military service to the march into Austria and the Sudetenland, to that fateful decision of June 21st, 1941, the Führer mastered these hours because he knew the following of his movement: his loyal officers and soldiers to be behind him. The spirit of our soldiers is the same as that of the Prussian army. Faith, duty, and loyalty lie anchored, immortal, in the heart of the common German man and of the German woman. Never have we realized more than today what importance precisely the virtues have that the Reichsführer SS has again and again emphasized to his men, namely loyalty and obedience. The German soldier is at every time good, courageous, reliable, full of trust, and ready to the extreme when he is well led. That is how he was in the First World War too. Let us close the ring tighter around the Führer, like the old Germanic following around their leader. The strength of the German folk is unbroken. It will show itself worthy of the fate that its Führer will once more give it a hard hour. Faith and loyalty are stronger than death. They are the unshakable foundations of victory. Now a quote from Frederick the Great. A poem, actually. Lower kind of soul, to sun itself in the pleasure of good fortune, well-filled air, it was only won by the mercy of chance, never in good fortune. Does higher meaning rise? If life is good to us, we do not rise over the swarm, but against misfortune and terror, to rise more proudly, to stretch truly. That is what I call, with honours, to prove manliness. SS Leitheft, Year 10, Issue 8, 1944.